process, start record. Is it recording? It is. Okay, so we're recording now. And welcome everybody. We're ready to go. All right, I'm Paul Gibson, co-founder of Retake Our Democracy. And as many of you know, Roxanne couldn't join us today. She's in Arizona supporting her family and her mother, who's in the ICU there. We'll do the best we can tonight. It's not just that I'm missing my wife, but she's my partner in this work. And when we do Zoominars, there are three of us who do this: Saraswati Khalsa, myself, and Roxanne, and we each have roles. And Roxanne's roles are really critical, and she's not here. So if we fumble here and there, forgive us. And just to underscore how stuff happens, one of our panelists notified us, 10 minutes ago, that a tree had fallen on his house. And so Walt McCree has no power, and Walt McCree will not be joining us, and he is the national expert we had wanted on the call. And just to show you how resilient and flexible we can be, we were able to secure the involvement of Ellen Brown, who wrote The Web of Doubt and Public Banking. She is the, I'm not sure your title at the Public Banking Institute, but it probably includes co-founder or founder, or at least a key person at the Public Banking Institute. So we will certainly have that national expert tonight. Joining her are Elaine Sullivan, who is the board president of New Mexico's Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity, and Angela Merker, and she's been in this from the beginning in New Mexico. Angela Merker is the executive director for the Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity. Melissa Pickett is the outreach coordinator for New Mexico's Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity. And Paul Stull is in the New Mexico Credit Union Association, who will describe why that association has endorsed the Public Banking Initiative. These folks have been at this for a very long time, and it appears that their expertise and their efforts will be rewarded, or could be rewarded, in 2021 in the legislative session, as the public's appetite for really meaningful change in many areas, we've seen it in criminal justice lately, is definitely on the rise. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are on stolen Tewa land, and we want to thank the Tewa people for being such tremendous stewards of this land for centuries. I also want to send out our hopes to the Navajo and Hopi Nation that they're able to turn back this COVID-19 assault that has been just withering their community. And finally, I also want to send out hopes that all of you are doing well, staying healthy, staying safe, and most of all, staying hopeful. While much of the country is starting to open, and New Mexico among them, I think we are beginning to see that the spike is now upon us, that it was inevitable from the utterly botched way our national leaders have managed this process, or mismanaged this process. So before we begin, in the chat, I want to give some, this is where Roxanne steps in, so I have to play Roxanne right now. I've got to go from some notes here. The chat bar at the right, I want to orient our attendees to, especially the new ones, to how this all works. There's a chat bar at the right, and if you don't see chat over there, you have to go down to the menu bar, hover over at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see a Q&A icon and a chat icon. And you use the chat icon, and you can select whether you want to direct your chat to panelists or to attendees. And I think you may even be able to select an individual participant and direct a chat just to them. And then also you'll see in the chat over there already that we have put in the Zoominars that we have coming up. And the next one is on the Health Security Act. and then another one on redistricting and gerrymandering on July 21st. So the information's on your right in the chat bar. We're working on another Zoominar focused on LANL, and then also one on the general election with Working Families Party and Olay. But we'll be publishing those. That would be in August. So here's how the Zoominar works. There's no time limit for speakers, but I'll moderate a series of questions that will consume about an hour. It may go a few minutes over, hopefully not too many. We want to leave time for you, the attendees. After we're done with the questions, we'll go to the attendees, and your questions will be asked 7:30, 7:35 until 8 o'clock. And use the Q&A icon at the bottom to put in your questions. It's usually a good idea to hold off for a little bit because you'll add in a bunch of questions that the panelists are going to totally answer. And especially with Roxanne not here, I'm going to be kind of navigating those questions and answers and moderating the panel. And so if we have 50 questions, it's going to be really hard. So, so that's where you put your Q&A. And if you just want to make comments in the chat bar, you can, get into conversation with others, and some of the panelists will weigh in at various points in time, especially when they're not engaged in answering questions. So use that chat bar. And all attendees are muted. You can't talk, and we can't let you talk. It's the structure of a Zoom webinar. But you are able to raise your voice and ask questions through chat and Q&A. There are two viewing options. You can view, and that's in your upper right-hand corner of the screen, and you can have gallery where you'll see everyone, or you could have speaker. It'll bounce around from speaker to speaker. And I find that very distracting. I think gallery is far better. But those are your options. So that's more or less what the issues are. And before we begin to ask questions, I want to put things in context just a little bit. For years, a relatively small group of people here in New Mexico has been pressing for a public bank. And Elaine was certainly part of that. We also want to acknowledge Craig Barnes. He was really one of the driving forces in the beginning, the late Craig Barnes. And he was just a total, he was a legend for his vision and intelligent compassion. And boy, in these times, when you contrast someone like Craig with someone who we have in the White House right now, we could certainly use a little compassion and a little vision. It's utterly absent. Their work began to coalesce around trying to create a public bank in Santa Fe, and some of us who live here in Santa Fe will remember that. The city convened a task force, and they came back with a recommendation that Santa Fe really didn't have the capital to make this a viable go. But they came back with a strong recommendation that the state was a platform, and they did have the resources to do a public bank. And in terms of capital, well, they have $20 billion in the state's permanent fund and $5 billion in the severance tax fund, and over a dozen other funds for different departments and initiatives with significant amounts of money on deposit, mostly parked in Wall Street and earning maybe 1%. And we know that Wall Street doesn't invest in us. So today we will explore how we could move some of those funds into a state public bank and how that would benefit New Mexicans and our economy, our infrastructure, our state budget. We were going to show a quick video right now. We decided not to do it. So we're going to just move on to the first question. And the first question we always ask the panelists is to take a moment to introduce yourself, maybe 30, 40, 50 seconds, something like that, and how you got involved in the public banking movement. And I'll call on folks so that people aren't all being shy and sitting there waiting for someone else to speak. So Elaine, you're up first.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you so much for this evening. Why I'm involved in this goes back a long way. I grew up in a small town in Western Kentucky. And when Walmart announced that they would be building in our town, the only person in my town who was not excited about that was my dad. What he said was, this will be the death of our thriving downtown. And he was right. It is in my cells to buy local, to support local business, to circulate our dollars in our own community. There are two reasons that I think it is time for this work. It is time for public banking for New Mexico. One of the reasons is that we're hurting. The economic and the health crisis, the incredible information that is surfacing about the racial injustice that we have tolerated. We have big systemic work to do. And the other reason I think it is time is we're ready. We have known for a long time that the global banking system is broken, but our group has done in recent years a lot of work, and you'll hear a lot about that this evening. The bottom line is it's time for us to bring our money home from Wall Street, invest it in our communities, and lift up the potential of New Mexico that is so big.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Melissa?
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Melissa Pickett, and I became very interested in public banking and localization after I sponsored the Economics of Happiness conference here in Santa Fe a few years ago and met Helena Norberg Hodge. And I have a banking background. The first half of my career was as a banker. And the second half of my career was in the healing area. So public banking for me is much about the healing of finance and the bringing in new ways, and how can we use finance so that it's healthy and so that we're healthy inside of it. And I agree with Elaine, now is the time.
Okay, Angela.
Thank you, Paul. I first came into awareness of public banking also through the Craig Barnes work and We Are People here in Santa Fe when that group initiated. And then when I moved to Albuquerque, we formed a study group on public banking here. We have, so that touched my interest and touched my heart. I also have been very engaged in social justice and economic justice issues over the years, especially in the past positions I've held since living in Santa Fe, working with families living in poverty. And it has always been striking to me about how we can hold such amazing amounts of sovereign funds in the state and also have such a high percentage of poverty, 21% before COVID came. So it was a natural intersection for me to engage in looking at the potential of what can we do through public banking to make a difference and keep these funds local and keep them working for the people of New Mexico.
Okay, thank you, Angela. I sent you a quick note in chat. So how about you, Paul? We'll save Ellen for last.
We'll save the best for last. I think that's great. In any case, yeah, I am the President Chief Executive Officer of the Credit Union Association of New Mexico. And I just want to set the stage for that so that you understand maybe why I'm here and who I represent. I represent about 42 credit unions in the state. They are responsible for the management of about $11 billion in assets altogether. They operate about 150 offices throughout the state. And credit unions are not-for-profit financial cooperatives. And that's the official definition of what a credit union is. It's founded on 7 cooperative principles. I'm not going to go through the 7 principles, but the main idea is to help advance the financial independence of each and every credit union member, no matter where they are on that ladder of achieving financial independence. And I am a big believer in economic justice. I believe that I've seen that throughout my career, to include a number of years in the healthcare system, seeing people that are just ravaged by one illness that destroys their lives with no help available. Financial institutions that are not-for-profit are set up to really help people get back on track. Some of the things we do is offer free financial counseling, which not enough people take advantage of. We try to do away and work against the usury of payday lending, which also traps people into debt. We work very hard to try and be involved in our communities and participate in programs that give people that ability to get ahead, or at least to keep their head above water. It's a very difficult job in New Mexico because many of the people that live here are disadvantaged in so many ways. We specifically have outreach to the Hispanic communities. We do have credit unions that are dedicated specifically to those who are not citizens of the United States. We try to bring them in to get them involved as a member of the financial community here and to try and help them live a normal life in the United States. Those are things that we participate in. And my involvement in a community bank, I think, becomes pretty obvious because everything about the public bank is about cooperation. It's about advancing our communities. It's about growing jobs. It is a economic strategic strike force that can be brought in to address community issues such as lack of housing, lack of health care, community issues such as natural disasters, currently in the wildfire season. These are the strategic strike force kind of things that a community public bank can work on together with local lenders and local financial institutions. And the reason that credit unions would do this, quite simply, once again, not-for-profit financial cooperative. There is not a profit motive. There is a motive of helping people. So
Okay.
we like to call it people helping people, but that's why I would be here, because of the fact that everything we're talking about relates back to the charge that credit unions have for helping their communities and helping their members. So I've probably gone on way too far, but I do believe that it's important for our audience to understand why a financial institution would be so supportive of a public bank. And the reasons are limitless.
Okay. Well, Ellen, what have you got?
Okay, thanks, Paul, and thanks, Paul.
Little notice. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, yeah. I was trying to review the questions, but I guess I'll just wing it. Thanks, Paul Stull. I'm glad you see us as allies. You know, that's not always true, so that's great. That's one barrier that we've gotten over. So I'm the co-founder and current chairman of the Public Banking Institute, and I've written 13 books, 3 on this subject. I wrote Web of Debt first published in 2007. I started writing articles on the Bank of North Dakota in 2008 after the crisis, because I knew that North Dakota was the only state that had its own bank. So I was watching it. I mean, its own publicly owned bank. So I was watching it, and it turned out it was the only state that escaped the credit crisis, the only state that never went in the red. It had the lowest unemployment rate in the country, the lowest foreclosure rate, the lowest default rate. the most local banks per capita, 6 times as much as the average of other states. So I started writing articles about it, and that generated a fair amount of interest. And so we formed a Google group, and we went round and around for a couple of years on all these issues. And we got some really big hitters. There was one woman who actually worked for the Federal Reserve, and we had a bunch of old-time money reformers, like from Australia and New Zealand and the UK. And so we really learned a lot about banking through this Google group. And finally, we decided that we'd done enough talking and it was time to get out there and do something. So in 2011, we formed the Public Banking Institute, and we've now got over 50 groups across the country working on this project. And I think there are currently about 25 bills that are on the books, and some more active than others.
Well, in January, we'll add another one to that list.
Oh, great. Okay.
So thank you very much, Ellen. So Ellen, you've been at this for many, many years from the beginning. So can you just give us a bit of a backdrop without getting too much in the weeds? Can you tell us what a public bank is and why we need it?
Yes, I'd like to talk a bit about what it is and what it is not, since there are a number of myths that float around out there about something that is pretty new. And I also would encourage you to see the video that we won't be looking at tonight, but on our website, there are several videos, and they're very informative about what a public bank is, what it is not, and what the benefits of it can be. One of the elements that can be confusing is that you and I would not be going to a public bank for our individual banking, to have our individual bank account. We would, in this business model, encourage that you and I be doing our individual private banking with community banks and credit unions. The public bank is a depository and a place for investing our public funds. What you and I currently, our taxes, our fees, what we currently send to the state, most of those funds get put into the global banks and they go to Wall Street for investment. So that's one difference. Another difference is that worries some people is that a public bank would be managed by professional bankers, not by politicians. There is considerable concern about that. And what is true is that there is a very important part of the business model. It works in North Dakota. It can work in New Mexico. It is a part of the business model that creates a firewall. And the firewall makes a very healthy boundary between political influence and the running of the bank, which is done by professional bankers. Another element that Paul spoke about wonderfully, I love the term, Paul, an economically strategic strike force. It reminds me of what the Bank of North Dakota has as one of its claims to fame, and that is agility, which Ellen, you were talking about also. It is not competitive with not only credit unions, as Paul has pointed out, but also with community banks. On the contrary, the business model is a partnership, as Paul spoke about, and this applies also to community banks. The Bank of North Dakota gives us a stellar example of the success of this. This partnership really works for them, and it can work for us. And it is a partnership that has outcomes, including more loans can move into the community than the local financial institutions could do by themselves. The local financial institutions get new customers, and there is a growth in local financial institutions. Currently, North Dakota has 10 times more community banks per capita than New Mexico has. Every other state in the nation is losing their local financial institutions, particularly the community banks. And North Dakota in the last decade has added some. One more thing that I will say at this point has to do with transparency. Transparency is so important when it comes to the use of our public funds. And in the case of a public bank, there would be a very clearly defined mission statement for how we wanted our public funds to be used. And we want to be seeing that, in fact, that's what's occurring. The global banks have no legal obligation to be transparent about how they use our public dollars. We only know how they're using our public dollars when they end up in the headlines for yet another egregiously fraudulent practice that they've been engaged in. Even at the state level, with all the funds that we have there, it's very hard to get transparency. It's hard to understand where are dollars getting deposited, how are they then being invested, because we have such a complex system in New Mexico. And I think I'll stop there and we can entertain questions.
Okay, so we have one more for you, Elaine. You're not off the hook yet.
All right.
Now that we have some idea of what a public bank is, can you fill us in on what the Alliance is doing to try and advance the public bank, and where are we in terms of the 2021 legislative session?
The first part of what you said is what we're doing right now. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Say it tell me the question one more time.
Just what are you doing to try and advance this? What's the effort right now to educate and motivate people, besides doing the Zoominar, for example?
The effort is widespread and it's very exciting. One of the things that we've been doing is reaching out across the state, doing outreach about our educational campaign to communities across this large, diverse state. We have an increasing number of legislators who are listening. And as certainly Ellen could attest, the positive media attention across the nation has dramatically increased. And that helps us to send our message about what are the benefits of public banking. In addition, at our level, and 3 people on this call are involved in that committee, we are about to release a white paper on public banking. And this is the result of a year-long effort, primarily volunteer, by people who are very well qualified in banking, in finance, in banking regulatory and compliance issues. And the document includes a pro forma that shows the first 3 to 5 years of how the bank could be expected to operate. This document is incredibly important, partly because it will help legislators and others get a better grasp for how the public bank for New Mexico, I started to say North Dakota, how the public bank for New Mexico can be structured, how it can be governed, etc. Those are some of the things we're doing, and we will have 2021 legislation. Our intent is that in 2021 at the legislative session, we will get a bill passed and we will have a public bank for New Mexico.
So you're not going for a study, you're going for a bank.
We've done the study. We don't need another study. It
All right.
is incredibly complex.
I'm with
Yes.
you. No memorial this time, huh? All right.
No, we're ready to go.
All right. Angela, you're up next. When I wrote this question, I didn't know she was going to be sitting on the panel. Here's the question. Ellen Brown is the national expert on public banking. And I've read both of her books, The Web of Debt and The Public Banking Solution. While both were just mind-blowing, and we were talking about it before our attendees got on the call, or some of them were on the call, I think it really opens up your eyes as to how the banking system actually works. And it's almost like you can't believe it's true. Can you try and lay out how the banking system actually works and sort of contextualize that for us so that we understand how public banking may be different from that? You're muted. And
Perhaps we can put the graphic up now. And I'll be speaking to that. So if we take a look at the left side with the current system of private banking, this will give us a model of what's happening now as it applies to the state of New Mexico. We are the citizens at the top of that left circle, or at Public Banking Institute, it's called the bicycle. So this first wheel starts with the citizens of the state, and we pay in to the state treasury, taxes, fees, and other monies, but primarily we're talking about the taxes and fees, and they go into state government. And currently, when that money reaches the treasury, it's dispersed in a number of ways. It goes into designated funds, such as a permanent fund. It goes into the severance tax fund and other funds that have been established in the state. It goes in and it's allocated based upon legislation that's actually been implemented through the state government that allocates what percentage of funds go to what kinds of projects, whether it's infrastructure, education, economic development, agriculture. All of that is broken out through legislation and distributed accordingly. So if you look at the moving from the state government into Wall Street, into the global banks, we look at the first arrow is the revenues that are going into deposits into Wall Street. Now, Wall Street and the whole that private banking system is not a competitive system. They pretty well have their own rule set, and you follow our rules or we don't work with you. Currently, the state of New Mexico has its primary operational funds in Wells Fargo, and the large funds, the permanent funds, and the severance tax funds are managed through JP Morgan Chase. You'll see that once those funds go into Wall Street, we know that in the last couple of months, information has come out that in those global banks, only about 10% of the deposits that individuals and businesses and governments make are invested back into entities here, even in the United States. 90% of it goes into investments out of the country or into what we call the shadow bank. And it goes into the stock market, it goes into speculation, and it goes into the derivatives market, where it's intended higher risk financial products. And it's the number one goal there is generating profits for Wall Street, for the shareholders of Wall Street. There are remains of that you can see as revenue moving back from Wall Street to the left that goes back into state government. But the Wall Street is sitting as an intermediary between the generation of profits off of the funds that we've deposited and getting back to the state. If we go to the right, do you mind if I move to the?
Oh, absolutely. Let's talk about something happier.
All right. Well, the happier is that public banking and the system of public banking is much more positive and much more constructive and has much more potential for developing thriving communities in New Mexico. Because if you see the total circle, you see that we're still paying into state government, but those deposits are moving around and going into our own piggy bank. They're going into a state bank. And out of that state bank, investments are made based on what's been determined as priorities and priority types of investments for the state by the state. We elect the legislators, we influence the legislators to create those policies, and those policies are enacted by, as Elaine was pointing out, experienced banking officials who are selected because they are experienced and because they are also have a civic servant kind of mentality that they're working with. They in turn make investments in the local economy, whether that be municipalities, counties, or state government. But the whole intention is to keep that local. So they're working to leverage funds with community banks and credit unions, as Paul indicated before, and the loans are created and interest is paid. It comes back into the state government, into the state bank, and it keeps generating. It builds a spiral of returns on investment. So if we're talking about the state bank, in contrast to Wall Street, we're creating funds for ourselves. If we started with say $100 million capitalization of the bank, we have the potential, following the chartering regulations, we have the potential of being able to generate loans in the amount of not 100 million, but 10 million, 100 times 10 or 100 times 8. We've been using a factor of 8 as a multiplier in our pro forma to look at what would be possible in creating loans for infrastructure, loans for economic development, loans that would assist communities in being healthy and thriving with their bridges, with their school buildings, with broadband, with small businesses that are thriving in the communities, because the bank, the credit union, and the public bank are working together to leverage those loans and make them happen and keep the money circulating here.
Let me ask you something, Angela. Let's take a concrete example. Right now, rural New Mexico is, and indigenous land and tribal land are really without good infrastructure at all, without telecommunications. And
Right.
they were to come to the legislator and ask for legislature. First of all, they're not going to go to Wall Street. They're not going to give them a dime. So how does that with a public bank, how does this both empower the legislature and animate community banks and so forth, so that the public bank, maybe there's a bill passed that puts a certain amount of money in from the legislature, and then we use that to leverage the public bank, and the community banks come in. Lay all that out for us.
So what can happen is that the legislature says, we really want you to develop a program on expanding broadband into our communities. And so the legislature sets out that they would like, not necessarily a specific allocation, but they'll say to the bank, we want to invest at least a portion of our funds into expansion of broadband and technical services for our communities. So the bank creates a fund that will be out of its own holdings, and it establishes, through the relationship with the community banks and the credit unions, it establishes a shared set of criteria for what will make that possible by the communities, by the tribes, by the various entities that are potentially to come after that. But it's set up as loan arrangements the bank is a nonprofit, so it's not paying taxes like a commercial bank is. They can offer loans at a lower interest rate. There will be administrative fees given to the community bank, added on, to support the administrative costs of the community banks and the credit unions, but they'll still be able to offer loans at lower rates than the commercial banks will, to the tune of, in the past, it's been up to 2 to 4 points difference. But they put the focus on it and say, let's look for these projects. Let's look for the potential here. Where can we do the outreach and make this happen? But it has to do with that perspective, that focus, that influence of the legislature saying this is important. And that's one reason why the state bank is so crucial in adding resilience into our financial system, because it can focus on these needs that are emerging and be more closer to the action to make it actually happen. It has to do with that agility and addressing the needs.
Okay.
So it's the financial difference. In some cases, what could happen is that some communities would develop bonds elections and establish bonds to be set up for this. The challenge there is that with the bonds, the payments, the money is going out of the state again, and the cost of the bonds can be 140% of what the initial value of the bond is. So building a loan instead of issuing bonds also is a means of reducing the cost of the services or the outcomes that are desired, and it puts more money is available in the state to invest in other projects. It stretches our funds further. It keeps our funds local and keeps them circulating so that in fact the monetization of the financial services is not getting sucked off of the local funds.
Okay, well, thank you with that. Melissa, we haven't heard from you yet. How our economic and social and criminal justice, all of our social systems and our economic systems are in sort of chaos, and they've been exposed, especially during the COVID pandemic, but long before that as well, is just not serving the interests of people. How can a public bank become a critical partner and a player in the state's recovery from not just from the COVID, but the gas and oil recession that we're experiencing at this moment?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I want to take a step back here and address that the big picture. Paul, as you mentioned, our economic situation is and has been not a good situation for a long time. You know, our current economic story, rooted in a global economic model, doesn't work for everyone, except perhaps for the multinational corporations and global banks. For the 21st century, we need to shift from such a strong emphasis on globalization and more emphasis on localization. We need a human scale. We need support for community economies. We need a new ethic of equitability and inclusion. And we need a new economic story centered in our well-being and the well-being of our planet. We need to maximize the number of times money circulates locally and stop sending our money to Wall Street, as Angela has explained. The COVID pandemic has shown us just how fragile and unreliable and disconnecting the global economic system is. And it's heightened our awareness of the importance of local self-reliance. You know, I consider disconnection as the greatest health tragedy of our time. We all want and share the desire for health and well-being, a safe place to live, clean air and water to drink, a stable climate, time for our family and friends, good healthy food. But what we're actually getting is farther and farther away from that than ever. And thanks to the COVID, we have an opportunity. Here's the happy, Paul. We have the opportunity to make choices to reconnect, and we have the resilience to bounce forward to something better. And creating a public bank is a part of this building forward. So how could a public bank help us build forward? Well, let's take a look at food, something we all share, something we all have in common. If we had a public bank in place now, we could begin to rebuild our food system by focusing on healthy soil and making a shift to regenerative agriculture. We could stabilize our local food supply chains. The New Mexico Healthy Soil Working Group has just announced a study which reveals opportunities in agriculture and food for New Mexico economic recovery and growth. And they have made a policy recommendation to establish a public bank to help regenerate New Mexico's agriculture. So that's very exciting. You know, even before COVID, as was mentioned earlier, New Mexico ranked 3rd in the nation in child food insecurity. And we rank 8th in the US in overall food insecurity. And more than 70,000 people who seek food assistance every week in New Mexico. Between 30 and 40% are children, and 21% are seniors over the age of 60. We have almost 25,000 farms and ranches in New Mexico, yet we export 97% of what we produce, and we import 95% of what we consume. So for example, if you can you see what this is? It's a carrot. Did you know that New Mexico used to be the biggest exporter of carrots in the country until big carrots were no longer wanted by consumers because they wanted little carrots? Well, in New Mexico, there are no food sheds for the farmers to use in infrastructure to be able to turn big carrots into little carrots. So we export the carrots to California where they're turned into little carrots and then come back into New Mexico and across the country for purchase. That's just an example of infrastructure for farming that could make a big difference. Solar is another area where a public bank could make a big difference for our state. Utility scale, smaller scale infrastructure build out, rooftop projects, community solar development, all could be financed by the public bank. The public bank, as we've mentioned earlier, could support infrastructure upgrades and development, roads, improve healthcare facilities, water, housing, broadband. Public banking could finance supply chain restoration and supply chain transitions. We've seen in the COVID how supply chains have broken down. Tribal farm projects could be financed, health related and emergency management systems, innovative water containment, waste management systems. As you can see, the opportunities for what the public bank can uplift are only limited by our imagination.
Well, thank you.
I think that,
Oh, go ahead.
well, I was going to talk a little bit about Bank of North Dakota, but I'll put that on hold for right now.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask you about the Public Bank of North Dakota. Great minds think alike.
Oh,
Also going to ask,
okay.
there's other agricultural things like, I know I read that we export our corn so that somebody else can make New Mexico tortillas. And that we export our livestock from our ranching industry because we don't have the facilities to process the meat or to butcher the meat. But there's an endless number of things like that. We've got a hemp industry that's about to explode, and hemp can certainly be just a product for CBD and things like that, but it's also can make plastic pipe and all kinds of things, but we need the industries and the capacity to produce them, and that's another thing that the public bank can do. So Melissa, can you talk to us a little bit about how the North Dakota Bank has functioned and how they, I mean, they were founded, I think it was in 1919, so it's right Depression era.
Yeah, so the public bank in North Dakota has been around for 100 years. I think we probably all have heard that. And I'll give an example for how Bank of North Dakota has stepped in during this COVID time. The North Dakota is an agile partner with the credit unions, community banks, and small businesses. And as you know, the access to the PPP loans has been very difficult for small businesses. So the Public Bank of North Dakota put the business community on alert. So they were ready for the CARES Act, and businesses were able to quickly apply for the PPP funds. And as a result of that agility and quick action, there are more PPP funds per worker over $5,000 in North Dakota than any other state. Additionally, the Bank of North Dakota, they didn't stop with support of the PPP loans. They put in special loan programs for small business, whereby small businesses can receive up to a $25,000 loan at a 1% fixed rate. And historically, the Bank of North Dakota has stepped in with programs like this in disaster times. For example, several years ago in a severe drought situation, they worked with local banks and credit unions to help farmers refinance their lines of credit to get them through the downturn in the ag economy. So Bank of North Dakota puts into place, and I recommend, if you're interested for more information, that you go on the website, Bank of North Dakota's website. You'll find a complete listing of all the innovative loan programs that they have. And as was stated earlier, the community bank and credit union health and financial environment is very strong in North Dakota, and that's directly attributable at a time when we're losing community banks, for example, all across the country. The success is directly attributable to the support from Bank of North Dakota. So the potential, Paul, for what a New Mexico public bank could do to lift up opportunities are endless, and they abound for changing our story. Here in New Mexico, we're limited only by the stretch of our imagination. So Paul, back to you.
Okay. Well, it's time to hear from our substitute pinch hitter, Ellen Brown. She had no time to prepare for this and hasn't seen the questions. So I'll try and throw her softball one first. All of this sounds really great. So good, in fact, that it causes one to wonder why we only have one state bank. So this is a two-part question. Why is it so hard to get more public banking going in the United States? And despite the barriers, what is simmering in other states?
Okay, well, we actually have two public banks now. Bank of American Samoa is the second one. It was formed last year. It took them 2 years just to get a master account with the Federal Reserve. We heard the reason was that the Fed did not want to establish a precedent for public banks. So you can see there's a lot of resistance, I mean, largely from the big Wall Street banks. They're our only competitors because a public bank does not compete with the local banks. It partners with the local bank. It's, in fact, the Bank of North Dakota, for example, says in their charter that they are not allowed to compete with the local banks. So their competition is Wall Street, and that's the whole idea, to keep their money in the state. North Dakota, of course, is a very Republican state, so it's not about socialism. It's about keeping our money local to use for our own people. Across the country, as I mentioned, we have like over 50 groups and over 25 bills that are currently being pursued. In California, we had a win last fall where AB 857 was passed, which was a bill to set out the parameters for a state charter for a publicly owned bank. So first of all, it established that we could have public banks, because there was some question about that, but you know, that I mean, we kept making the argument, the legal argument, that of course we could, but then you just always get pushback. You know, somebody would raise the question. So it established that for one thing, and set out all the requirements, and it established public banking as a sort of pilot project. So we were allowed to have only 10 banks in the next 7 years. These would be municipal banks. So all the cities got together and formed the California Public Banking Alliance, and there were 10 cities or 10 groups that got to either city or a group of cities that got together to push this bill. And so they're all competing to be first, or they were before this virus. Of course, that's kind of put many things on hold, unfortunately. But the most likely would be Los Angeles, of course, and San Francisco, and the East Bay group are heavily pursuing the matter. Mm-hmm. One problem is finding the funds for a business plan. In California, there's one expert that everybody's trying to get, but he is like $250,000 to do the whole business plan. I mean, this is very complicated, you know, because you have to set up every detail of how the bank is going to work. And we also have a bill that was pursued last year, and it's being reactivated this year, to turn the infrastructure bank into a depository bank. We have a what's called an infrastructure bank, but it's really just a revolving fund. And it's got just a small fund. It's got $300 million in the fund. And so it lends out this $300 million at 3% on average. And at the end of the year, it makes 3%. And there's 20 times as much demand for these loans as they actually have the money to make loans. So if you turned it into a depository bank, this is one of several advantages of a depository bank. You could then make 10 times as many loans. So instead of 3%, you would make 30%. Of course, you've got to deduct your costs. But right now, this is an excellent time to set up a bank, because the Federal Reserve, as of March, just threw open the discount window to all banks in good standing for 0 to 0.25% interest. So that's currently the bank, if it wants to add more money, or the infrastructure bank, called the bank, if it wants to add more money, it has to do a bond issue at 3 or 4%. And then the problem with the bond issue is it's liable to be a 30 or 40-year bond, and you don't really need all that money all that time. So you're paying extra. It's better to have a credit line. Anyway, another option is right now we have these special purpose vehicles set up by the Treasury and the Federal Reserve with a municipal liquidity facility where banks can borrow from the Fed directly, supposedly, but the interest rate is the going bond rate plus a penalty of 7.75%. So you're paying quite high interest to borrow from the Fed. Whereas if you're a bank, you can borrow for virtually nothing from the Fed. And even if you're not a bank in good standing, they only put a 0.75 penalty on it. So you can still borrow from like 0.75%, even if you're a bank that's about to go bankrupt, apparently. So that's one advantage. You can get your money much more cheaply than if you have to go to the bond market. Of course, you also eliminate all those bond fees. And then the other advantage is leverage. You can make 10 times as many loans, and and that not only do you make more profit, but you also are helping your community. You're getting money into the community. Paul Gibson, when you mentioned that it was hard to believe how the banks actually work, I think what you're referring to, and this was, this is what my whole first book on this subject was, Web of Debt, was basically on the fact that banks actually create our money supply. They create 95% of our money supply. And when I wrote that book, it was like conspiracy theory, and I really had to fight for it. But in 2014, the Bank of England came out and acknowledged, I think because the positive money people kept leaning on them, the local UK public banking group, or money reform group, And so finally, the Bank of England came out and said, contrary to popular belief, banks do not lend their deposits. They actually create deposits when they make loans. And in fact, they said 95%, or they said 97% of the UK money supply is created in this way. So it's a complicated procedure how that goes. But the point is, if you want to get more money into your community, we're not just talking about recirculating existing money. You're actually creating new money by turning your revolving fund, like you've already, states and cities already have revolving funds that make the same kind of loans that we're talking about. If you're not talking about individual loans, the infrastructure type loans, they already have revolving funds to do that. But if you turn it into a depository bank, you can actually get 10 times this money out there in the form of credit. And in fact, all of our money is actually credit.
Thank you for that, Ellen. And I just want to reiterate, it's so hard to explain something like this in 7 minutes or in 5 minutes. I really recommend the Web of Doubt. You'll get about 2/3 of the way.
Web of Doubt, actually.
It will explode because you just won't be able to believe how money becomes real or exists. It's not real. We're going to move along now because, and I want to acknowledge, we're going to encroach just a few minutes into our question and answer from our attendees. We'll go over if we have to answer questions that are related, that are left on the table. But now we're going to talk with Paul. Everybody's sort of laid out how, on some level, the public bank is not a competitor of credit unions or community banks, yet community banks are very fearful. They're opposed, basically, to the public banking. Can you lay out a little bit more about how they actually function as a partner, not a competitor?
Yeah, I think that's and I do want to thank Ellen for doing a great job on telling us how money is created. I call it the Mobius loop, but we can make money here in New Mexico. And we do know the secret. Ellen knows the secret. Angela knows the secret. We all know the secret. So if you don't believe that, we do. We have the recipe. So I'm very pleased with making sure that everybody understands that. But I don't know, I don't want to really look at this in a way that sets up like or don't like. Community bankers, I used to be one many years ago. I'm a lot older than this blurry video looks, but nonetheless, community bankers, if they're true community bankers, their heart is in their community. They want to see their community grow. They want to see jobs created. It's good business for them. And they understand that secret too of how money is made. I think we're in a situation, and this is with many things in our country right now that you pointed out earlier, Paul. We seem to have two factions. One is the status quo, and the other is let's move forward and get out of this rut that we've been in. And that kind of applies to everything that we're currently addressing in our country. I think community bankers, if their heart is in their community, understand this and probably do or would support a public bank here in New Mexico. I think what it is it gets back to the same thing with status quo. People are just plain afraid of things that they don't understand. Those of us that are in this webinar, we don't have that problem. We're the kind of people that go out and learn and understand and develop free thought around other ideas. Is there another approach, or does it always have to be the same old way? And the same old way has not served us very well. So I do want to kind of avoid that idea, Paul, of bankers being diametrically opposed I don't think that is totally the case. Yes, I think some, not all, and I do think that we've got some work to do. I know there have been some conversations. I have not been in those conversations with our community bankers here in New Mexico, and I know that we'd like to continue that dialogue. I felt it was important for my group to endorse this idea, not to create more animosity, but to say, hey, this is a good idea, and it's one that can propel New Mexico forward. So I don't want to paint every community banker with the same brush. I do want to paint a group of people with the same brush, and they are the national money center banks. I am an outspoken critic, for those of you that know this, it's not a secret, of Wells Fargo and some of the other money center banks who are in this for a much different reason. They are very active here in New Mexico with political contributions. They have lobbyists in Santa Fe, in New Mexico. And, you know, they are actively involved in what's going on in New Mexico to help their profit margin. And for them to lose the kind of money that they make from New Mexico and other states, well, that's something that they certainly have a vested interest in. For many banks, Wells Fargo, I believe, just to throw this out on the national level, I think they employ about 300 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. 300. You know, that's more than one per congressman, if my math is right here. But nonetheless, that is where I think, Paul, the big pushback is. And a lot of times, you know, I think our community bankers could say, well, I'm a banker, the Wells Fargo guys are bankers, you know, they must be smart, I'll go along with them. But I really think that if we can get our community bankers to have a better dialogue with us, to understand how this can create that Mobius loop of generating more money in New Mexico, more jobs. You know, deposits create loans, loans create jobs, and jobs create more deposits. It just works that way, and our community banks will benefit from that. I also would like to mention the fact that in New Mexico, locally owned community banks are going away. The number of locally owned community banks has gone down every single year since I've been here, which is 7 years now. And I'm sure it was going down before that. That is a shame because of the fact that a strong financial services industry, homegrown, locally owned in a state, is a great economic engine. And the state of New Mexico, through its financial institutions division, has not done a very good job in trying to support these organizations. Yeah, they're regulators and they regulate safety and soundness, but they've got another charge too, and that charge is to make sure that financial services are readily available to the people of New Mexico. And I would dare say that that is a much more serious obligation for the Financial Institutions Division than regulation happens to be. I mean, after all, they've got partners that help them with regulation, like FDIC, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, on the credit union side, the National Credit Union Administration. There are plenty of regulators out there to help them. Who isn't out there to help them are people to keep them in business and help make them strong and grow in New Mexico. And so I would invite, and I hope maybe we do have some bankers with us tonight, but I would invite them to look at the kind of support that they need to grow their businesses and to serve their communities. I know their heart's in the right place. I do think they need to take a step back and look at what support they're getting from the state that they could get from a public bank. They could be able to make loans that they currently are not willing to make, because the public bank could help guarantee a portion of those loans. They certainly could expand some of the services that they offer. But there is a reason that that they are not currently fully at the table, but I would like to see them at the table, and I'd be very happy to pick them up in my car and drive them to the table because it is a benefit. And believe me, Wells Fargo, Chase, Bank of America, they are so happy to eat the lunch of these community bankers that it's not funny.
All right, we're going to have to move on, Paul. And so
that is my view, and it may be a very controversial view, but believe me, I have no problem speaking out about that.
Okay, well, thank you. We're significally over, so
I'm sorry to take so much time, Paul.
it wasn't just all of us had a lot to say. Elaine, can you just take a couple of minutes and let people know how they can get more information and maybe get involved with what you're doing?
Yes, and I want to just put very briefly a context because I am about to ask for your help. The late Craig Barnes, who, as Paul said, was an incredibly inspiring leader for us, was always clear about this. A public bank is a vehicle, a very critically important vehicle, but a vehicle to a higher purpose. And that higher purpose for our organization, the Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity, that higher purpose is about social justice and environmental justice and economic justice. And the underpinning of all of that is economic justice. Bringing our money home so that we can have it circulating in our communities, invested in our communities in an equitable fashion. We talk a lot in New Mexico about environmental justice and about sociocultural justice. There has to be money to fund projects to make systemic change in those areas. So what I am about to ask you for is to help us, because economic justice is the underpinning, and without it, talk about social justice and about environmental justice is just a conversation. Let's not settle for just having a conversation about these critically important systemic changes. So here is your opportunity to help change the future of New Mexico. I have some specific requests. One of them is for finances. It costs a lot of money in New Mexico to spread an educational campaign about public banking around the state. And we would appreciate your help to whatever degree you can help us. We have an exciting, generous challenge grant that we are trying to match, and we have one more week to do that. The challenge grant is for $30,000. We have raised $19,000 of that. We need $11,000 by end of the day on June 30. Help us if you can. You can go to our website and hit the donate button, or you can mail a check to our mailing address, and we would be very grateful. Consider a single contribution or a monthly contribution. And now you're looking at our website and a way to reach us, the info@aflep.org to reach us also. Please help with our challenge grant if you can. A second way that you can be a big part of this is to send us your contact information for friends, for neighbors, for colleagues. If we add your friends and colleagues to our mailing list, it greatly expands the opportunity for them to learn about public banking and for them to have the opportunity to participate. And they can always unsubscribe if they are not interested. And finally, volunteer. Talk to your friends and neighbors in an informal way, hold a Zoom house party, put our information on your organization's newsletters. and speak with your legislators and your public officials about public banking and encourage them to learn what they need to in order to support this.
Okay. As we move forward, I'll try and track down in fact, you could do this, Elaine, while I'm going through the questions and answers. You send me some information that will be sent out to the people on the call on the Zoom in a day or two, but maybe you could post it into the chat room, the chat on the right there while I'm sorting through this. We've got some questions, and I apologize that we've only got 15, 20 minutes at the most for this, but one of the questions that came in was, how would the public bank work with like our pensions? One of the people calling in or writing in on a question and answer was concerned about that their pension money was being invested in things that could, totally speculative, and their pension was at risk. How would that work? Would the public bank be able to work with our state pensions? And that could be anyone. Go ahead, Ellen.
Well, it depends on your state. We were told in California we can't touch the pension funds, but you could arrange it so that the pension funds could, you could be using their deposits. They do have a certain amount of deposits. The one problem is pension funds want 7% interest, or 5% is what they're really making, I think. But either way, that's very high for if we use the pension funds to capitalize the bank. So it probably is not going to be related to your pension funds at all. That's what I would say.
All right.
Yes, and in our current bank model, which we've just written, and the paper will be coming out, we do not include pension funds as a part of that.
Okay. So would the public bank have to apply to the Federal Reserve and to get a charter? And would the public bank, I'm guessing that the Federal Reserve is not aching to offer them up to public banks, and Ellen's got her hand up.
If you wanted to, any kind of relationships with other banks, you've got to have what you need is a master account with the Fed. That doesn't mean a membership. You're not going to buy stock. You're not going to be one of the owners of the Fed. But for example, as I mentioned, the Bank of American Samoa took 2 years to get this master account, but now they did grant them a master account. So they've established a precedent. So we can have a public bank can get one. So hopefully we'll be able to get one too.
All right. Another question was, let's see here, it just came up. Who would pick, there's a big controversy, not a controversy, but a lot of people assume this would just be the bank for the legislators to fund their own little projects and so forth. There's going to be a board. And who would pick the board? The board would be the ones that set the guidelines. How does that work, and who would pick the board and so forth? Elaine, do you?
I would like to pass that question to Angela or Melissa because they were both on the banking committee.
Melissa, you want to take it?
Okay. The way that we've written in the model is that there would be a citizen committee, if you will, who would make recommendations for board members. And we've laid out exactly the experience and the expertise that the board needs to have in order to be considered. And those recommendations would be made to the governor. Am I remembering that correctly, Angela? Or to the governor, who then would appoint that board. And we have a rotational board, so the board members can only be on for a certain number of years. But it would be made up of people that have background in finance, banking, within the business community, people that are professional and would be appropriate for being able to represent New Mexico.
Elaine, you were going to add something.
I'm remembering that maybe 2 years ago, Senator Worth recommended that we consider, and I believe the banking committee did operate with this model, the way New Mexico gets its judges is that the Bar Association recommends those people that in whom they have the most confidence. And those are the names that go then to the body that is choosing. And in this case, it would be the governor. So I believe it's the same model, using the professional experts who can say, this is a person with a proven track record, consider them.
So I've got a couple questions that I think you can answer real quickly, but I want to honor that they were asked. Will you offer shares? So could I buy shares in this bank? And then will there be branches across the state? And ahead, Angela.
It would not be a retail bank, so there wouldn't be branches around the state. There would be a single entity. And so it's not a retail bank, it's a banker's bank. And I'm sorry, the first question was
Shares.
the shares. We would have shares in the bank, not literal shares, but by virtue of being citizens of the state. It would be a state-owned bank. We all collectively own it as a part of the state.
Okay. Let's see. Another person was commenting that nonprofits are getting squeezed these days. Is there a way that a public bank could work with nonprofits?
I'll do that.
All right, go, Ellen.
No, I said Paul. Don't you think
Oh, Paul?
Paul Stull?
I'm sorry, I'm wondering which Paul we were talking about. They're both great
Right,
people.
because you're a nonprofit. So the question was, how the public bank could work with nonprofits.
I wouldn't see any reason that a public bank could not work with not-for-profits, particularly those that are providing services in communities that are, well, obviously, we were talking earlier, Melissa was talking about food and processing food here. There may very well be a need for a cooperative to process those carrots. And, that could be a not-for-profit cooperative that would benefit those farmers. And there would be many other examples as well. But I certainly do think another good one might be that in some of the Native communities, there may be a need for healthcare services. They could be put together by a not-for-profit, and the community bank might be able to put up some funding to help create that, to get it off the ground. Not as operating funds, but as an investment to get a building, to hire medical personnel, to get the equipment they would, whatever the case might be. So yes, I think there's a very strong possibility that there would be great uses for the public bank with not-for-profits.
Okay.
Yes, and just keeping in mind, just to add to that, keeping in mind that the relationship is with the borrower and the community bank or credit union. That's where the relationship resides.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So one person, Gary Ferguson, wrote about how right now in New Mexico, the State Investment Council could be investing its funds in renewable energy, for example, and it doesn't seem to be doing that at this time. There was legislation passed in 2020 to encourage them to do that, but for right now, the Navajo Nation is planning to hire a French company to develop their solar energy resources in Four Corners. How would a public bank be, and obviously then the money flows out of New Mexico. How would a public bank be able to offer an alternative to that? Angela, you are nodding your head, so I'm going to throw it to you.
Well, it would have a function because it could be leveraging loans locally and working with businesses that are either forming or established in the communities to help make that happen. But this is the second instance of development of financial support coming in from outside. Navajo Nation, just in the last year and a half, ended some discussions that they were having with a Chinese bank to actually establish what would have been a public bank on Navajo land. And the deal fell through, but so there's a lot of interest in coming in to invest in that area, and we could be doing that in the state and leveraging the funds and supporting local businesses that aren't necessarily going to be supported by a French company or a Chinese bank coming into Dene land or wherever throughout the state.
Ellen, you're going to comment?
Well, I would just add one advantage to a public bank like the Bank of North Dakota is that they can take the long view. So whereas a private bank has to be working for the short-term profits of their shareholders, even though there are good loans that could be made, but they have to take the one that makes the most money. So they're going to take the big hedge fund or whatever. They're not going to do the little local business, even though the local business may be perfectly sound and profitable, but not profitable enough. Whereas a public bank is thinking in terms of what's good for the community, and they can wait for years and years for it to pay off.
There's a good segue to the next question. And there's two parts to this question, and both of them are good, but I'm gonna start with the second part. What happens if a loan is not repaid? And I know I read recently that North Dakota intentionally offers loans to reasonably high risk small businesses, knowing that they're not gonna necessarily have a 100% repay rate, but it gets back to what you were saying, Ellen, about it's being about the community benefit, and if it can stimulate
Jobs, yeah.
and a little bit of a risk.
Excuse me, their default rate is only 2%.
Yeah, that's what I kind of remember.
Taking on the higher risk loans.
Yeah, a better or an interesting example is China. They let loans default right and left, and they don't put the banks into bankruptcy, and they don't put the borrowers into bankruptcy. And that's their theory, is that it's better to keep the community going. And because the state owns, like the federal government owns 80% of the banking assets in China, and you know, they've got the deep pocket, they've got the central bank, they can let these loans ride. And they've actually increased their money supply by 1,800% over the last 20 years, and they still don't have price inflation. So, well, now because of pork shortages and things like that. Anyway, that's what you could do if you actually had a public central bank at the top. You could let those loans ride, and it would actually be good for the community.
Here's a question. I am not. I don't really have a handle on how whether this is possible, but does a public bank have a role to play in things like environmental restoration, things that are plugging some of the orphan wells that the gas and oil industry are going to leave behind? There's not really a product that you can sell or a profit at all to be made, but there's a something that needs to happen. Is there a way a public bank could play a role in that?
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Let
Ellen.
somebody else answer if you want to. I don't want to answer them all.
That's all right.
Sure. Well, not directly. I mean, you know, if we're talking about fixing the roads or something like that, what the public bank would do would be save money for the state or for the, you know, whatever community owns the bank. And then some of those profits could be used for all those other things that need to be done.
The Bank of North Dakota returns half of its profit back to the state coffers, which over time has turned out to be about $3,500 a person. So the profit down the road, the profit that is generated by the bank, and it is mandated to have a profit even though it's not for profit, can go back into the state coffers, and that money can be directed into whatever projects we the people would choose to put that money into. I would also say that behind those restoration projects, there are businesses, there are consultants, There are professionals, there are environmental businesses. There's all kinds of businesses that are going to need financing to be able to stay in the game. So in that regard, the public bank would impact.
Okay, we're going to take maybe one or two more. There's some really good questions here, but how would the public bank work with organizations in like the State Investment Council and the New Mexico Financial Administration? Is it NMFA? I'm not 100% sure that I have the acronym correctly. Anybody?
Well, there are some, the initial capitalization could come from one of those funds, for instance. And so it would be like the SIC, instead of investing in hedge funds and BlackRock and whatever else, they'd be investing a portion into a state bank. So that would be one place where there could be a connection. NMFA would be a different story. There are some similarities in what they do, except that it's what they do primarily is very tied up in bond issuance. Whenever they issue a loan, there's a bond behind it. And so there are a lot of dollars going out of the state to support, to pay for those bond issuance costs that that the state is carrying. They've started to do what they call I think they call them secondary loans, that are loans supporting, that are put together in collaboration with other loans for some economic development. And I believe that the Senate Bill 3 that was just passed, the governor hasn't signed yet, but that 400 million, wasn't it, that was to go to small businesses for economic development, and then also some funds for cities and counties impacted by COVID-19. I believe NMFA has been charged with overseeing those. So, you know, I think there would be some work on building relationship or determining what and where functions go. But there is a difference in NMFA with only the bonding power, excuse me, and not the bank designation, doesn't have the ability to increase the capacity, the financial capacity to create even more financial support in the state. I see that as a major distinction between what a bank can do and what NMFA is currently doing. The bank could actually generate more financial capacity to address the significant needs that we have here in the state that NMFA would be restricted from.
Okay. We had one question, and this will be the last question, then I'm going to wrap up. A person asking about home mortgages, and is there a way that and I want to extend that question into just affordable housing in general. Are there ways in which the public bank could play a role? I mean, here in Santa Fe, we're constantly hearing that, you know, we can't really afford to build really affordable housing. We can afford, you know, it's affordable for, you know, someone making $60,000 a year, but not for somebody who's 12. Is there a way in which the public bank could play a role in that? And will they be issuing mortgages?
Oh, I'll jump in on that one, Paul. The public bank will be very unlikely that they will ever actually issue an end mortgage. Those mortgages would flow through community banks and credit unions. And the community banks and credit unions would work together with the public bank to finance projects that could bring about affordable housing. There are really two issues here. One is a mortgage and the other one is affordable housing. And affordable housing may or may not involve a mortgage for the end user. But it would work in a way that the banks and unions would work with the public bank to make these loans to help facilitate the building of housing, and the state certainly could play a role in that as well. But no, the public bank would not issue an end mortgage, and no, they would very unlikely be involved in the day-to-day operation of any low-income housing or whatever you happen to come up with to solve this problem. It would be through probably a community organization that wants to manage this, is looking for the financing, has a good plan, and is looking for a way to make it happen. So there's really three levels here. You need a community organization to champion this. Then you need the bank or credit union to help bring about the lending piece. And then you need the community bank, which will either stand behind or guarantee the lending to make it more attractive to solve this problem. So I hope that does a good job, but clearly, no, the public bank is not a retail bank. They would never make a mortgage loan to an individual.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all the panelists for being here tonight, especially for Ellen, who came in with like 5 minutes notice. And I'd just like to encourage the people that are still on the line that this is complicated. It's not sexy, but what it can do is almost magical. And what it can do is empower projects that are dreams right now. And when you go to try and make them happen, you have legislators and mayors and city council members say, well, we can't really afford that. We don't have the money to do that. And the public bank can be an important contributor in that way. And it can make it possible to do things that right now we can't do. And the reason we can't do them is because our money is sitting in Wall Street where they just squander it. So I just want to thank everybody who's been on this call. Retake will continue to be publishing articles that lay out different scenarios for how a state public bank, if we had one, this scenario, this is what would be possible, and this is why it hasn't been done before. And so it's just very important that we keep educating ourselves and that we start educating others. And then the final thing is people were asking who would be the bill sponsor and who would be introducing the bill. And I know from conversations with all of the panelists that they're not quite at that step. They've had conversations with a number of legislators, and they want to get the white paper done, be able to share it with people. And I don't think there'll be any difficulty in identifying a bill sponsor with some serious credibility. Is that pretty much correct, Elaine? And yeah, I'm seeing nodding heads. So almost 10 after 8, that's, if Roxanne were here, there's no way she would have let that happen. So we'll blame her. Thank you all for being here, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with a Zoominar on the Health Security Act. Stay tuned.
And Paul, thank you, and thank you to Roxanne and Retake for your support of public banking. Kudos. You rock.
Thank you, Paul. And if I can just remind once again, please send AFLEP a contribution before the end of the month. We have the challenge grant. We need your help. Even if it's a couple of bucks, it will help us get there. And we will get there.
All right. Thank you. All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Be well. Stay safe.
Well, stay hopeful.